Hello, welcome back to Art History with Dustin Mothersbaugh. This is part 2, Introduction to Ancient Greece. So, Ancient Greece. In the beginning. So the Minoan culture, which we talked about, it began around 3000 BC, and we talked about in part 1. 3000 BC, the beginning of what we call the pre-Archaic period. The Archaic period began in 555 BC. The Classical period begins in 477 BC. The Hellenic period begins with Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC. So Greece, it's made up of many small states. Greece, Greek art and culture, it reached its pinnacle in the 5th century BC, although the time of interest was 700 BC to about 100 AD, and Greece really is responsible for the giving of us in Western culture. It's the root of Western culture, which has been under attack. The root of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Our culture is based in the Greco-Roman tradition. That's what we call Greco-Roman. So here you kind of get a map of what ancient Greece looked like. You can see how some of the isles, like there's Crete all the way down at the southern part of the map, you know, the separation of the Mediterranean Sea, but you can see the Ionian Sea, the Aegean Sea, the Black Sea, and the Sea of Crete. Okay, so my favorite thing, if I didn't do art history, or aesthetics, my favorite subject in the world, besides making art, is philosophy. So Greek philosophy, there are many what we call the pre-Socratics. So that goes from Thales all the way up through Heraclitus to Pythagoras. But we have, in particular, the pre-Socratics, the sophists, which are really like our modern day philosophers. The sophists like Protagoras and Gorgias. Protagoras said the man is the measure of all things, meaning very subjective view of human experience. There isn't truth, or why even bother? What is that? Everything is measured by the senses, which at an extreme is very subjective. It's subjective to each individual's sensations, right? Taste, touch, sight, sound. But then comes this gadfly, as he called himself, Socrates, who was actually sentenced to death for corrupting the youth of Athens. Socrates gave us the Socratic method, or the dialectic, like an intellectual dialogue. He would probe and poke and agitate. That's why he called himself a gadfly. The establishment of Athens and Greece itself. And he was accused of being an atheist, but he actually was a monotheist, not a polytheist. He didn't believe in Zeus and Hera and so on and so forth. Plato's Apology is one of the greatest short little works that everybody should read. I mean, he had many students who stayed behind and tried to give dialogues of his account of what his discussions were, among them being Xenophon and Plato. Plato, or Platon, came from an aristocratic family, and he has many what we call the early Platonic dialogues. All we have are these dialogues. They're kind of like scripts or plays where these people are bantering back and forth about philosophical ideas. What is justice? What is truth? And it's these ideas. Plato's theory was heavily influenced by Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Heraclitus in particular. And so what Plato ultimately thought, and as you can see the image here to the right, we have Plato pointing up to the heavens holding his Timaeus, which is his very metaphysical creation speculation, dialogue, and then to the right you have Aristotle, his greatest student, who holds his hand over the earth and holds his ethics, Aristotle's ethics, where life is about finding happiness, the pursuit of happiness. These two men disagreed on almost everything except there is a god or a prime mover. It's monotheistic. And for Aristotle, it was the prime mover that set things into motion. But he's more like a clockmaker. He's not so much like a divine interventionist, and it's not quite as fatalistic or determined. But they both agreed that reason was an absolute, and this comes in from Socrates, and this is what separates them and puts them in the great classical age of Greece, the creative period of thought. Plato is really like the mystic. Plato's Republic is a great book. I recommend everybody read it. Plato's who systematized philosophy into different branches. And his allegory of the cave, isolated from book 7 of the Republic, is definitely worth reading. It's the matrix philosophy. It's what we're dealing with now, the illusion that we see breaking around before us. And then, of course, his great student Aristotle came up with the Athenian democratic constitution. His ethics and politics, bar none, are absolutely fascinating. He took many aspects from all forms of government and kind of gave us a prototype idea of checks and balances. So, great influential thinkers. Raphael's painting on the right, the School of Athens, we'll see later. Phenomenal, phenomenal, phenomenal. The subject of many artworks to come and many ideas to come, and no civilization has stayed a civilization in the West without these thinkers' ideas. So you also have some really great poets. So here up on the left, you have Homer, the oldest, and then down on the right, you have Hesiod. So one major source of Greek myth, it is found in paintings. It's found on Greek vases, stories of the gods and goddesses of heroes and heroines. Another source in literature of the period is Hesiod's Theogony, which gives you an account of the gods. So you had the Olympians, against the Titans, and so on and so forth. Homer was responsible for the epic poems, the Iliad, which is about the Battle of Troy, and its follow-up sequel, which follows Odysseus from the Iliad to his own Odyssey back home. And most people are probably familiar with the Odyssey. So here we actually have, speaking of Greek gods and goddesses, Greek vases would tell many stories. So Kronos here ate and killed his own children, according to myth. He had with his wife Rhea. Rhea saved Zeus and gave Kronos a stone to eat instead. That stone is actually still on display, the ones that the Greeks thought was the stone. When Zeus came back, he killed his father and released the Olympian gods. The Olympian gods won out the battle against the older Titans. So the victors, the Olympians, well, that includes Zeus on the left here. He was the god of the sky and lightning and thunder. He presided over all. Next you have Athena, which is the goddess of warriors. She was actually born from bursting, fully grown, from Zeus's head. Then you have Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and she was born of the foam of the sea. That was from the severed reproductive organs of Uranus, which was killed by his son, Kronos. So here you have many symbols and their definitions, Greek gods and how they're identified. You can always pause this video to get this information if you need to. I'm going to move on. So here we have a temple, the temple of the Oracle of Delphi, and it is the Tholos of Theodorus. That's what it's called. So one of the most important structures of architecture in ancient Greece was actually the temples. And so the altar, it often sat under the open sky, directly in front of the temple. I mean, we're dealing with astrological types of, society here. And while the inside was used for storage of treasury and associated with the god or goddess, that's the temple happened to be made for. So in ancient Greece, why we call this the Tholos of Theodorus. Tholos just means circular. It's a circular temple. Ancient Greece, it was famous for its mass gatherings of city-states to witness athletic events. And so from these events, the Olympic Games, so Olympic Games, was derived. Ancient Greece is responsible for the Olympics. The games were held in a stadium that was open to any man as a form of entertainment. The traditional stadium had a main ground for the competition, where the competition took place, an altar, and it had only a very few seats. Often the surrounding embankments would become a substitute for seating. So this is actually in Athens, Greece. Now we have to discuss the different types of columns. Colonnade are very important to Greek architecture. You have the Doric order, which is what you see on the left. In the middle, the Ionic, and then on the right, the Corinthian. So these orders, they're noticeable in their columns, which stand prostrate underneath the frieze. So relief sculpture with the figures. The frieze is under the gable, which is usually the flat and wide triangular shaped top, where the roof meets each side. And there are 3 parts to each column. So each part has the capital at the very top, the shaft, and then the base. So here you can kind of see what I was describing. You see the top of the triangle where the gable is, right underneath the roof. And then you have your frieze, which is where your sculptural little figures would go, the entablature. Going down to the capital, the shaft is just the long part of the column, and then the base. So what's interesting is that the Doric is just very, very simple, but here you see the Ionic on the bottom and on the right side. It's supposed to look like a scroll. Now, up in the top left, we have the Corinthian, which is the very ornate and flowery, voluted decoration. So here is the Parthenon, and it's in ancient Greece, and it's at the Acropolis. Any time you see the word polis, it's just the top of the city-state, the Acropolis. It's the complex building at the top of the city. It had religious and political agendas, and it was the epicenter of its day. Athens is named after Athena, who was the goddess of war, wisdom, and the arts. And the Parthenon acted as both Athena's place of worship, and as the treasury. So like all past civilizations, the Greeks worshipped their pantheon of gods. They're polytheistic. However, they did value humanity in a way that differed from their predecessors. So they did invent, like I might have mentioned, democracy, which if you break down the etymology of that word, demos means the many and kratos means rule. So the many rule. It's also where we get the idea of mob rule. They refined the mathematical system from Pythagoras, who implied that all is number. And they gave us, and of course, who gave us the Pythagorean theorem. He actually was influenced by Orphic sects and influenced Plato, who later became a Pythagorean. But ideal human proportion, I mean, it's found in Greek interest in all of their architectural and figurative sculptures. The Greeks still influence us today. They really do. And it's foundational to Western culture. I cannot emphasize that enough. The upper culture, towards the end, it was called the Hellenic culture. And that gets its name from Helen of Troy from Homer's The Iliad. So, what's interesting is the Parthenon had actually been burned. It was burned in 480 or 479 BC by the Persians. And so it was rebuilt the way that we see what is left of it today. Athens was one Greek polis or polity, again a city-state, of many, and it became the predominant one of Greece that housed the money and power to protect all of Greece. So it actually acted like our current central banks. Sculptures originally adorned the Parthenon and were lavished in reds, blues, and yellows, and gold and ivory in Athena's case. In the center was that statue of Athena, which is no longer there. It stood 38 feet tall, and this is what we could call the epitome of classical architecture. So I did actually get to go this summer to visit Nashville, Tennessee's and Centennial Park's Parthenon. Now you can see the triangular shape with the gable with the frieze under it, and then the Ionic column, or the Doric, the Doric columns. So I've actually been. This is my own photo, kind of going back and forth here. I actually did visit Athens, Greece in 2010 in between different protests because of the collapsing economy. They were needing to ask for more money to be bailed out by the EU. The one thing I will never forget is when you're walking up those rocks to get up to the top of the Acropolis, there's no concrete, there's no industrial railing. You are walking up rocks with intermittent posts tapped into the ground with a rope railing. And I was grabbing that thing for dear life sometimes, because let me tell you, the rocks you were walking on were slippery. They were waxy feeling. And what it was there's been so many people have come to see this that it has actually polished the rocks around the Parthenon. It's just absolutely crazy and fascinating. Going back to the Parthenon reproduction in Tennessee, which is definitely something I recommend. If you can see any of these things, by all means, please go see them. There actually is, behind my wife, it's hard to see, and there's like a person in a blue and a person in a pink shirt with a white hat. You can actually go inside, and there's a museum of paintings and artwork, which would not have been in Athens, but the Athens Parthenon. But there is a recreation of Athena. Not made of actual gold, but you get the idea. So you walk inside and you see this ginormous statue. She's holding Hermes. She has her spear, there's a serpent, and she has her shield. Very fascinating. Okay, so Greek culture did include painting. It included ceramics as well. And ceramics included narratives. So, for instance, the Parthenon's frieze, it did engage figures in battle with the Lapiths, which were mythological creatures. And so the pottery would do something similar to that. Their pottery, it elaborated on the oral tradition of myth. So here is a vase that is depicting Ajax and Achilles, and they're sitting there waiting on battle, playing just a game. So you can see the details. There's clothing. There's a distinct body formation to each of these men in these parts. These details are here. Subtle variety of tone, color, and likenesses. And this particular pot, the shape of it, it's known as an amphora, which it was used to carry wines and oils. And there are actually two types of figures on pots. There's the black figures and there's the red figures. So a master potter, they would have like a crew to make pots, and there would be like a master painter. The painter would use like watered down clay with pigment in it, and they call that slip, and it'd just be refired. And it would be used to define and differentiate the surfaces, because we're almost dealing with like a figure ground reversal here. But there is a three-phased fire to get the slip to turn the black areas black, and the converse for the red figure technique. A bilingual pot is one that actually includes both methods, making black and red figures. So here, like there's amphora down on the bottom left. Here you can see the common types of shapes. And each of these different types of ceramic pottery pieces would have a different function. They would all do something somewhat different. So here you have more examples, different types of stories, similar, right? Do these look like the same story, just told with a reverse? So it'd be the black figure technique on the left, the red figure technique on the right. Yes. So, what a fascinating and rich culture Greece is. Greece gets conquered eventually by Rome, and Rome consumes it, takes liberties, but pretty much re-elaborates Greek culture. And we'll be dealing with Rome in the next in the next video. But before I do that, I would like to try to talk a little bit about the two different types of viewpoints. Here we have early Greek, and then on the left, and then we have Roman on the right. So despite their similarities, there are differences. So here you can actually see what we call a kuros, or male youth, on the left. And this is made out of marble. They are both made out of marble, but many Greek pieces, as we said, are made out of bronze. So this one comes from circa 590 to 580 BC, whereas the Roman one on the right comes from about 120 to 50 CE. So finally, moving after year 0 here. So the kuros was the male youth. The female youth is called a kurai. And it is a little bit different than the one on the right because it has ideal proportions, because the Greeks are obsessed with the ideal, almost to a mathematical fault in some cases. Now, this Roman copy of the spear bearer, or Doriphoros, this is Polykleitos. The original actually is lost, so all we have is this copy in Marvel. It's very naturalistic. It's very realistic. There's like the blemishes, so the imperfections of the body are seen just a little bit. And the stance is what we call contrapposto, and it just means that the balance and the stance of the human shift their own weight too. So one thing you might notice is down on the bottom left from us of the figure on the right, of the spear bearer, you might notice a trunk, a ridged trunk that is holding up behind his leg. Well, it does kind of look like a tree trunk, but it essentially was there to help support the figure, because otherwise it would collapse. It wouldn't be able to hold up the weight of the marvel accurately. So we can kind of see a difference now. That there's an evolution from this more prototypical culture to its successor, the Roman culture. And we'll go ahead and pick up there next time.